Man, it's wild to think about how conversations evolve on this podcast. Like, we'll be sitting here talking about movies, about creativity, about the weird quirks of directors, and suddenly it spirals into something that's so much bigger than cinema, so much more layered than just storytelling. And today, that whole thing kind of happened when Quentin Tarantino started to talk about Islam. And I got to tell you, like, whenever Tarantino gets going, he's not just riffing, he's diving deep. He says pulling out references, history, analogies, and the way his brain works is just fascinating. Because this is the guy who can connect spaghetti westerns with Eastern philosophy, who can draw a line between samurai films and gangster flicks. And when he shifts that energy toward religion, toward Islam, toward these massive cultural phenomena, it's not only shocking, it's eye-opening, because you're hearing it from someone whose entire life is dedicated to telling stories about humanity, about violence, about redemption, about morality. So when Quentin looks at Islam, he's not looking at it like a scholar, he's looking at it like a storyteller, like a dude who's trying to figure out what makes people tick, what makes cultures resonate, what makes entire generations move in unison under the power of belief. And that's powerful, man. That's something that makes me stop and think, because I've had a lot of guests talk about faith, talk about God, talk about different traditions. But when you get someone like Quentin, who's not traditionally religious, who's not out there preaching, who's not a theologian, but who still gets struck by the narrative energy of Islam, by the cinematic vibe of it, it hits you differently. And I found myself just sitting there nodding like, yeah, dude, you're right. This religion has something cinematic about it, something that feels epic, that feels like it belongs in a Tarantino movie, and not in a disrespectful way, but in a way that acknowledges the scale, the drama, the intensity of belief. And he started talking about the call to prayer, how it's not just a religious act. It's like this soundscape that covers cities, this auditory reminder 5 times a day that life has structure, that there's something higher pulling you back to the center. And I swear the way he described it was like a soundtrack, like the score of a film. And I've never thought about it that way. Like, imagine you're living in a city where the soundtrack of your life includes this melodic, haunting, powerful call echoing through the streets. And that's shaping your psychology, shaping your identity. And for a director like Quentin, that's just fuel for storytelling. And he was saying how Islam has this blend of discipline and beauty, of ritual and spontaneity, like the fasting during Ramadan, where people push themselves, deny themselves food and drink, and yet when the sun goes down, it becomes this communal explosion of energy, of joy, of eating together, of bonding. And he compared it to the way he structures his movies, the tension and release, the buildup and the payoff. And that blew my mind, because I've always seen religion as this kind of serious thing, heavy and structured, but he reframed it as art, as rhythm, as cinema. And I think that's a perspective that could open a lot of people's eyes, because whether you believe in God or not, whether you follow Islam or Christianity or Buddhism, there's no denying that these traditions carry an artistic essence. And Islam, specifically with its poetry, its architecture, its music, it's so goddamn cinematic. And Quentin went into that like he was breaking down mosques, the way he would break down a movie set, talking about the geometry, the way light filters through, the way the space makes you feel small but elevated at the same time, like the way he shoots wide shots in his films to make you feel both insignificant and important in the story. And I was like, damn, man, you're onto something. And this is why I love having him here, because he's not giving you dogma. He's not trying to convert anyone. He's just observing, just telling you what he sees. And that honesty is refreshing. And of course, we also got into the controversial stuff, because it's Quentin Tarantino. He's not going to tiptoe around. He mentioned how Western media often frames Islam in this narrow negative lens, always about violence, extremism, conflict. And he was like, man, that's lazy storytelling. That's propaganda level storytelling, because you're reducing an entire faith with billions of people, centuries of history, to one flat villain role. And that's bad filmmaking, it's bad storytelling, and it's unfair to the reality of the religion. And I was sitting there like, holy shit, he's right. Because as a culture, we do that. We flatten Islam into a stereotype. We don't look at the layers, the poetry of Rumi, the philosophy of scholars, the mysticism of Sufism. We don't look at the family structures, the hospit. the way community functions, we just zero in on terrorism or some extremist fringe. And Quentin was calling that out. And I appreciated that because that's the kind of honesty we need. And he even compared it to how in his movies, villains are never just one thing. Like when he builds a villain, he gives them depth, he gives them quirks, humanity, because that's what makes them real. And he said, if you portray an entire religion as one-dimensional villain, you're basically doing a bad Tarantino knockoff. And man, that stuck with me because he's right. Nuance matters, storytelling matters, and the way we talk about Islam in the West is basically lazy storytelling. And he said what fascinated him was how Islam builds this sense of identity in people. Like you can be anywhere in the world, in Europe, in America, in Asia. And when you're Muslim, there's this connection, this unity. And he said that's something Hollywood struggles to capture, that sense of universal belonging, because it's not about nationality, it's about belief, and that's bigger than any flag. And I thought, holy shit, that's true, because we're living in a time where identity politics is tearing people apart, where everyone is hyper-focused on their micro-label, but Islam has this macro-label that connects people across borders, across cultures, and that's powerful, that's cinematic, that is the kind of epic scale Quentin loves. And the more he talked, the more I realized this guy isn't just analyzing Islam. He's vibing with it on an artistic level. He's seeing it the way a painter sees colors, the way a composer hears music. And it made me think, like, maybe that's the bridge between art and religion. Maybe religion is the oldest form of art, the way humans told stories to make sense of life, to deal with suffering, to find meaning. And Quentin just tapped into that vein like a filmmaker mining for gold. And it was honestly one of the most fascinating conversations I've had about Islam on this show. You know, the craziest part about this whole conversation with Quentin was how natural it felt. Like it wasn't forced. It wasn't some staged discussion. It was just one of those organic moments where you're sitting across from a dude who has lived his entire life in the world of stories, in the world of culture, and he starts pulling threads from places you never expected. And when he connected Islam to his own work, I had this moment of realization that religion in many ways is just humanity's longest running movie. It's the narrative we've been writing for thousands of years, and people play their roles in it. Generations keep adding to it, and the script evolves, but the essence stays the same. And Quentin was literally saying that when he watches Muslims praying together, standing shoulder to shoulder, moving in unison, bowing, rising, reciting verses, it feels like choreography, like cinema, like one of those wide shots he loves, where a whole army moves together on screen, except here, it's not an army of violence. It's an army of devotion, an army of people sinking their bodies and voices for something bigger than themselves. And man, when he said that I couldn't shake the image because he's right, it looks powerful, it feels powerful, and you get why billions of people find meaning in that. He even told me about how he once saw footage of Hajj, the pilgrimage in Mecca, where millions of people circle around the Kaaba, and he was blown away because he said no film could ever capture that scale. No special effects could create that raw energy of human beings moving like a tide, like an ocean of faith. And he said, that's cinema without cameras. That's humanity's ultimate epic. And I just sat there nodding because I've seen clips of that too. And it does something to you. Even if you're not Muslim, even if you don't believe, you feel something in your chest watching that unity, that synchrony. And Quentin was like, man, that's the kind of image that directors spend their whole lives chasing, and Islam just has it built in. It's part of the ritual, and I couldn't stop thinking about how true that is. And then we went into this whole tangent about storytelling and violence, because Quentin being Quentin, he's always circling back to violence. And he said something that blew my mind. He said the West often accuses Islam of being violent, but if you actually look at Western history, if you look at the Crusades, the Inquisition, the colonial conquests, the two world wars, the nukes, it's like, dude, we're in no position to pretend we've been peaceful storytellers. And he laughed in that Tarantino way, that sort of manic giggle, and I was like, holy shit, you're right, because he's pointing out hypocrisy, he's pointing out how the dominant culture frames the other, and it's lazy storytelling again, painting yourself as the hero and the other as the villain. And Quentin was like, that's boring, that's propaganda. And I was thinking, wow, this is the same guy who gave us Inglorious Bastards and Django Unchained, movies that deliberately flip history, that exaggerate but also expose, and now he's flipping the script on how we view Islam, and it made sense. He also brought up this idea of discipline because Islam is heavy on discipline, the prayers, the fasting, the rituals, and Quentin said that kind of structure is what makes great art. He said, without discipline, you don't get Kill Bill, you don't get Pulp Fiction, because creativity without structure is chaos, and Islam has this built-in structure that keeps people aligned, keeps them grounded. And I thought that was interesting because in the West, we often frame discipline as boring or oppressive, but Quentin saw it as a framework for beauty, like the way a sonnet has structure, the way a screenplay has acts, and Islam gives people that screenplay for life. And he respected that. He even mentioned Sufism, the mystical side of Islam, and I was shocked at how much he knew, like he was, quote, Rumi, talking about the poetry of divine love, the whirling dervishes spinning as a form of worship, and he said that's cinema too, that's performance, that's art. And I was just grinning because here's this legendary filmmaker geeking out about spirituality like it's a film festival, and he's not mocking it, he's in awe, and that's rare, man, that's special. And of course, we touched on how misunderstood Islam is in Hollywood. Like Quentin was saying, if you look at most depictions, it's always the same cliches, the desert, the terrorist, the angry man with a beard. And he was pissed because he's like, dude, there are so many stories within Islam, so many layers, and we're wasting them by repeating the same shallow tropes. And he was saying if someone gave him the freedom, he'd love to make a film that captures the beauty, the contradictions, the poetry of Islamic culture. And I thought, holy that would be something to see. Because imagine Quentin Tarantino making a film set in the Golden Age of Baghdad, or about the travels of Ibn Battuta, or the poetry of Rumi. It would blow people's minds, it would shatter stereotypes, and it would be cinematic as hell. And then he brought up something I didn't expect. He said Islam is punk rock, and I laughed, but then he explained it, and it made sense. He said Islam challenges the status quo, it disrupts, it questions materialism, it flips the bird at excess, and he compared it to the way punk rock broke into the music scene, raw, unfiltered, not caring what the establishment thought. And I was like, damn, that's an angle I never considered, but he's right. At its core, Islam is rebellious against human ego, against unchecked power. It demands humility, and that's punk as hell. And only Quentin could come up with that analogy. We even got into this talk about how Islam views art, how there's debate about images and representation, and Quentin said he actually respects that tension, because it forces artists to get creative. Like, instead of portraits, they developed insane geometric patterns, calligraphy that feels alive, architecture that looks like math turned into beauty. And he said, that's genius, that's art under constraint, and some of the best art comes from constraint. And I just nodded because I've always believed that too. Like, you give people infinite freedom and they get sloppy. You give them rules and they innovate within them. And Islam has been doing that for centuries. Then he circled back to the human element, to how Muslims he's met in his life have been some of the most hospitable, generous people. And he said, that's something Western media never shows. But when you actually sit with Muslim families, when you share food with them, it's unforgettable. And he compared it to how in his movies, characters always bond over meals, over conversations at a table, like in Pulp Fiction with the diner scenes, or in Inglorious Bastards with that tense tavern scene, because meals are where humanity shows itself. And he said Islam nails that. Islam puts massive emphasis on sharing food, on hospitality, and that resonated with him as a storyteller. And man, as the conversation kept going, I realized this wasn't just Quentin analyzing Islam. This was Quentin holding up a mirror to the West, showing how shallow we've been in our understanding and how much beauty we've missed. And I couldn't stop thinking about how powerful that is, Because if a guy like Quentin Tarantino, who built his career on edgy, violent, stylized movies, can sit here and talk about the beauty of Islam with respect and fascination, then maybe more people can open their minds too. Maybe more people can put aside the stereotypes and see the cinematic, poetic, deeply human side of this religion. And that's the kind of conversation I live for. That's why I do this podcast. Because you don't get this on CNN, you don't get this on Fox, you don't get this in Hollywood. You only get this when two people sit down, open their open their brains, and just let the ideas flow. And with Quentin, man, the ideas never stop flowing.